Well, hello everyone. This is the live streaming channel of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum. Our speaker today is on my right. I'll introduce him in a minute. If you want to learn more about what we do, just click the link below that takes you to our homepage and you can have a look at our program. And you can also, if you wish, replay any of our prior forums using the link at the bottom of each item on the program. So this is our speaker today has spoken at our forum before. His name's Stephen Buckle. He's taught philosophy at a number of Australian and overseas universities. He's written a number of books, including one that's received a great deal of acclaim, titled Hume's Enlightenment Tract. Currently spends a lot of his time in Europe teaching at the University of Luxembourg, and he'd be over there but for the virus. He actually spends most of his time in a town in Germany called Saarbrücken, which is just, it's on the French border, just south of Luxembourg, southeast actually. Steve tells me it's, you can think of it as the German equivalent of Wollongong. I quite like Wollongong. I think Wollongong's a nice place. It shouldn't be, people shouldn't deprecate Wollongong. And like Wollongong, it's apparently running a bit short of coal at the moment. So gives you a sense of what it's like. His topic today is liberalism and its fashionable critics. He's going to focus particularly on what's called cultural Marxism and explore whether that is a term that makes any sense. He's also going to talk about postmodernism. He's going to try and give us a bit of a sense of what these terms might actually mean, and also to assess their credibility. In broad terms, he'll argue that they undermine belief in equality and rights and are self-defeating as political critiques of contemporary society. The format is what we usually do. If you've seen any of these before, he'll speak 15-20 minutes. I ask a number of questions. You can post queries and comments in the chat window at any time. I'd ask you to keep each of those concise, relevant and polite. They have to be concise anyway, because with the live chat there's a 200-character limit, but you can post up to 3 chats in sequence if that's what you want to do, want to expand a little. So with that introduction, I'll give the floor to Steve. So thank you, Steve, for your support over the years, and thank you for talking to us again here today. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Thanks very much, Peter. My talk today is sort of it originated as part of a response to the conservative view that Western civilization is under threat. I don't really share that view, but one thing I do think is that what many of the fans of Western civilization, or many of those who made that argument, think is under threat was liberalism. And I think, yes, there is a genuine threat to liberalism. Where I differ, or one way in which I differ from those conservative critics, is that I think what they mean by Western civilization essentially refers to the post-1945 consensus that appeared to triumph in 1989, and that Francis Fukuyama in the States proclaimed then to be the end of history, meaning that liberal democracy was triumphant and would remain so. Well, things don't look quite that way now because of various ideas which do threaten that sort of liberal democratic consensus. And the most common examples of this, as Peter mentioned, cultural Marxism and postmodernism, sometimes lumped together, but more often waved around in a critical fashion than explained. Now, I'm not going to claim that what I'm going to talk about with respect to them is going to be the last word on these, but I've picked out a few what I think are important elements of them and to try to show why they are not really adequate ideas. But first of all, what we need to do is get some sort of idea about what liberalism is. So the word liberal simply means free, or means a system concerned with freedom. So liberalism is a political doctrine, emphasises freedom of action and freedom of thought, and resists political control of these beyond any necessary minimum. So it does recognise that there are minima, but believes that the emphasis should be on promoting freedom rather than constantly focusing on ways of restricting it. Now, the freedom of action part I'm not going to talk about, but that side of liberalism has historically implied free markets, and so has tended to be a pro-capitalist idea. There's a difference, though, between English and American senses of the term liberal, and these go back about 100 years, maybe a bit longer, because of some influential theorists working in the liberal tradition who were influential in America, who argued that freedom of action is constrained by unrestrained free markets. And so liberalism should have more of a larger social policy, social welfare policy, than was typical of English liberalism. In Australia, it's still the case that the English sense of liberalism is probably the stronger. So when sort of untrammeled free market theory flourished again in the States in recent times, it was called neoconservatism over there, but neoliberalism over here. But the opponents of neoconservatives in the States were liberals in the American sense. Okay, anyway, my focus is on freedom of thought. And the hero of free thought, certainly for anyone in the philosophical tradition like me, is John Stuart Mill. It's not that one agrees with everything he said, but he certainly set the agenda and laid out some important issues. He argued that the only justifiable restraint on the liberty of thought and discussion was where it caused or was likely to cause harm to others. This meant that he rejected the idea that causing offence could be a justifiable restriction on freedom of expression. This doesn't mean he thought offence was irrelevant, but he thought that offence only mattered where it was harmful. So the test for, say, hate speech or the like is not whether it's hateful, but whether its expression is likely to cause social harm. So that means then that he would not have been a fan of Clause 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which a number of speakers in this series have spoken about. That clause says that makes an offence to offend, insult, humiliate, and intimidate from memory. Well, of those four, it's only intimidation which could really obviously count as harm. So Mill would have certainly would have supported that aspect of that clause, but offend and insult are much broader than he would have defended. Anyway, there's an implied commitment here in this argument that one should allow freedom of expression as long as it doesn't cause harm to others. That idea is that people can handle disagreement and can learn from it. And obviously, this is to be optimistic about human beings' capacity for rationality, for rational judgment, and so on. It's possible to argue, I suppose, that democracy as a system also has that kind of optimism, although many of the many theorists throughout history have been very suspicious about democracy, partly, of course, because they didn't mean representative democracy, the kind of system we have now, which in many ways is better described as a form of republic. That is because it's a system designed to capture the preferences of the people. In that way, it's a democratic republic, but the restriction of the influence of the people, the demos, through representation and through periodic elections is a considerable restriction on what was traditionally understood as democracy. So you find even philosophers like Immanuel Kant, for example, arguing that democracy is tyrannical, but republicanism is beneficial. Just as an aside, it's often said that Australia is a liberal democracy. Well, that's an interesting thought. Is it? Yes and no. Certainly a democracy because that's constitutionally built in. But liberal values are only partly expressed in the Constitution. And in most societies, most liberal societies, liberal values are protected by declarations of rights. Whether that's an advantage or not depends on how much one can trust, I think, the political instincts of the population. Anyway, obviously, the deplatformers of cancel culture don't share this assumption about human rationality. They tend to think of people as vulnerable, irrational, likely to be swayed or even corrupted by the expression of views with which they do not agree or approve. And so I think that is that tendency to cancel or deplatform does show a certain assumption about the irrationality of people and more particularly about the irrationality of society. That this is not something put in quite those terms, but it is implied by them. So, first of all, the idea of cultural Marxism. Now, my view is pretty simple here, that cultural Marxism isn't Marxism at all. That one nice little definition I've come across of it is that cultural Marxism is Marxism with class conflict replaced by intersectionality. That strikes me as quite a nice definition, and it shows why it's not Marxism, because Marxism is a theory about the economic structure of society being determining and social and cultural factors being the effect of those economic structures. So culture is not an independent force, but a product of the economic structure and its legal embodiment. Now, so I think actually what's called cultural Marxism is better understood as the revival of left-wing Hegelianism. Marx said that he stood Hegel's philosophy on its head by making material forces fundamental. The cultural Marxists stand Marx on his head and so revive the Hegelian view. So what is it about our, if you like, progressivists who are classed as cultural Marxists? My view is that, well, typically they're anti-capitalist, but that's not enough to be, that's not enough to count as a Marxist. But they have taken over one element of Marxism and made it, so to speak, or transformed it in order to serve their own purposes. That is, they've taken over the idea that society is a scene of conflict, a division between oppressors and oppressed. And when you think about it, that's pretty much the marker of almost any view which represents itself as left-wing or radically left-wing. The language of oppression is fundamental, and there's always an oppressor group who are guilty of the oppression. So Marx and Engels said that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, adding that oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another and carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. Well, that's what the cultural Marxists have taken over, but they've transformed. But in transforming it, they've lost any serious claim for it to be regarded as Marxism, not least because of the connection with the communist utopia. Right, the key claim of the Communist Manifesto is that the class struggles have been simplified by capitalism into the opposition between capitalist and proletarian, owner and worker, with the latter in the overwhelming majority. So a communist revolution can sweep away all class conflict by sweeping away all social classes. And so the communist future, the anti-capitalist future, or the anti-oppressive future, depends on on this happening, and moreover on no new class emerging, something which similarly did happen in Eastern Europe. Now, modern identity politics, for example, has the opposite tendency. It multiplies the forms of oppression. So the oppression identified by various categories, race, sex, sexual orientation, sexual agenda or gender identity, and so on. And this set of social groups is entirely heterogeneous. They do not make up a community. In fact, even the sexual one doesn't make up a community. The language of the LGBTI community, for example, is, it's just a fantasy. There's no community there. In fact, the goals of trans liberationists are plainly at odds with the feminists who want to protect the status of women from the intrusion of former men who have had sexual or gender transitions. And the final endpoint of this is intersectionality, in which you add up your various oppressed identities in order to then discover how multiply oppressed you are. So cultural Marxism is a misleading term for theories that have just taken over the conflict model or the oppressor model of society, that where the forms of oppression are racial or sexual or gender related. It's a very simple picture. It's one reason why it's so popular. It readily translates into political slogans, but in my view, it's hopelessly distorting. So I'll just say a quick word on several of these categories, just to show how what they amount to implying is that what is characteristic of the oppressor element of society is prejudice and its systematic and the systematic character of the prejudice. So in the case of race, the fundamental attitude of the oppressor class is racism, and the fundamental reality of society is then what's now called systemic racism. In the case of sex, the fundamental attitude of the oppressor class is sexism or misogyny, a prejudice against women, okay, something irrational. And the fundamental systemic reality of society is patriarchy, a kind of irrational and hostile force or set of political institutions, depending on the various ambiguities of that term. Sexual orientation on the oppression model, again characterised by prejudices. So the fundamental attitude of the oppressor class is homophobia, and the fundamental systemic reality, I think we can probably describe as heteronormativity. Now, in my view, the oppression model is a dud. It treats society as fundamentally irrational by defining the forms of oppression as set irrational prejudices. In order to put it that way, this is not to deny that prejudice exists and not to deny that racism and sexism and so on exist, but it's to deny the model that informs the ways in which these things are spoken of. And the problem with such a set of irrationalist theses about society is that agitation for social change then becomes impossible. Arguments are put in terms of the fight for social justice, and although that term is rarely, if ever, defined, nonetheless, any change that is ever going to happen is going to depend on the justice of the claims being presented, on the acceptance of the justice of the claims being presented. So, in other words, the oppression model treats society as fundamentally irrational, but has to appeal to rational considerations in order to justify activism or change. Okay, so that's my sketch of the cultural Marxist side of things. Now, just something about postmodernism. Postmodernism as a term, first of all, is one we should be suspicious of immediately because it's got such a self-congratulatory element built into it. It means you're more modern than the modern, and so you can see that self-flattery will go a long way in deciding to adopt postmodernist themes. And so, unsurprisingly, pretentious language is common. But nonetheless, there's, I think, a central theme that emerges. The Frenchman Jean-François Lyotard, in a famous work, defined the postmodern condition as a state of disbelief about grand narratives. For example, disbelief in the progress of civilization. So the advance of culture or the triumph of the West, anything of this kind is a grand narrative. One of the implications of that, by the way, is that anyone who calls themselves a political progressive and who typically appeals to postmodernist themes is actually appealing to a modernist term, okay? Progressive is something that doesn't make sense. Progressivism doesn't make sense from a postmodernist point of view. Instead, postmodernism is primarily governed by what it calls difference. And difference here, difference is not the same as differences. Difference comes with a capital letter and it's always in the singular. And there's a reason for that. Difference is somehow the fundamental character of reality. And the way I would describe that is to say that postmodernism is a form of anti-essentialism. Just a clarification here as well. It's true that everything is different from everything else. That's certainly true. But nonetheless, we can detect patterns and resemblances, and we make categories out of those patterns and resemblances. So one way of characterizing this is to say that sense perception is what picks out the differences, picks out the detail, and that reason then searches for underlying causes or resemblances that explain underlying causes that explain differences and indeed resemblances, I should put it that way. So in other words, sense discovers difference, particularity, reason searches for explanations, and in particular, in the physical world, at least, it searches for essences, what makes sort of fundamental explanations that say why things are as they are. And my view is that postmodernism is characterized by the rejection of that role. And so I see it as a kind of rejection of a role of reason altogether. One of the nicest ways, I think, to approach postmodernism is through architecture, partly because we can see the buildings and we can see how they're different from the older ones. Modernism gave us the stock standard office block with its bluntly rectangular shape and straight, unornamented lines. The modernist architects asked what the essence of a building was, and their answer was its function. And the famous architect Le Corbusier said, for example, that a building is a machine for living in. So for the modernist, form follows function, and this means that decoration, which is functionless, gets stripped away, and the building is reduced to sort of an abstract minimum. Its details are an abstract minimum, and hence the rectangular boxes with which we're so familiar. Postmodernism rejects the belief in essences. Buildings and even architectural styles have no essence. They're just ways of doing things. Decoration is rehabilitated, and since different styles don't embody essential qualities, there's no bar to mixing different styles in the one building. Hence the sort of mix and match character of much postmodern architecture, where very different styles are combined in the one building. In short, in postmodern architecture, there are no rules. And there are no rules because there are no underlying essences to determine them. Anti-essentialism thus breeds an extreme form of creative freedom for the architect creator. It's the architect's own preferences that guide the design. And so the architect is a creator in a grand sense. He's free to make the choices he wishes to put the building together in the way that he prefers. One of the more famous examples, well, several of the more notable examples of these around Sydney, the buildings at UTS, where we have the saggy paper bag building, the cheese grater, and a few others of rather striking and unusual styles. So I think that postmodernism is an anti-essentialist attitude. And when applied to issues like sex and gender, then you can see how an emphasis on choice, fluidity, etc., there being no rules again, there's just self-interpretation, and one does as one chooses, tends to rule the roost. Okay, so I won't say anything more about that now. For the moment, I'll just contrast anti-essentialism with what I take the scientific attitude to be, because both appeal to a certain kind, both appeal to skepticism in different ways, put it that way. I think the difference, though, is that the postmodernist view, by rejecting any essences altogether, amounts to an extreme form of skepticism, restricting itself to the appearance of things, always subject to change. Difference might spring to mind there, and there being no fundamental answers. Now, I take it that the scientific attitude, natural science in particular, is that there is a restricted skepticism. Appearances are only a guide to how things are, and one has to experiment and test and theorize and retest and so on, because the senses do show you enormous differences, and reason doesn't guarantee you the right answer. It's a constant attempt to get behind what the senses show us. And so science is a kind of fallible enterprise which aims to discover essences, and when defeated, digs around again to try and improve its story. But in some ways it's had spectacular success with this, and my favourite example here is the periodic table. When you think about the periodic table, that is not only something that you can decorate your bathroom with, and you can get shower curtains in it now, but it actually identifies the essences of the different elements. They're characterised by their different atomic weights, and those atomic weights are themselves a function of the number of protons in the nucleus, which determine the character and characteristics of each element. So there's a resemblance there, but I think, but the difference is that for science, the appearances is a starting point, not a finish, not a finishing point, whereas the preoccupation with difference with postmodernism is treated as, so to speak, the beginning and the end. It's sort of the ultimate story about things. So I'll just stop there and hand over to our chair.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're getting a bit of echo there. Is that okay now? Yeah.
I'm not getting echo, no.
No, it did momentarily. Sometimes it's supposed to be software that suppresses it, but it doesn't always work. Just a couple of points. I think you're right to say that cultural Marxism is an oxymoron. Always struck me that way from the outset. And it's interesting to reflect that an old Marxist like Eric Hobsbawm, a historian, back in the early 90s, he wrote an article for New Left Review where he said, what is this bloody stuff? You know, this has got nothing to do with what I understand to be Marxism. Marxism was a universalist ideology. It's not about carving up society into tribes and, you know, looking for points of difference. I mean, the only differences he was concerned about were class distinctions. So that's one other point. But the other interesting thing about it is, say what you like about the old communist ideology, and I don't have any time for it. It's led to terrible human tragedies, but it did have a kind of an end point in sight, you know, a kind of society that had looked forward to coming into being, a utopia where, you know, the exploitation of man by man, as they said, would come to an end. And in fact, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, who started out as a Marxist and subsequently became a Catholic, wrote a book called Marxism and Christianity, where he argued that Marxism was a kind of secular transformation of Christian eschatology. But the point being that they actually had a vision, you know, as it turns out, a terribly flawed and unattainable vision, but they actually had a vision of an endpoint. Whereas the pattern of activism that's arisen out of identity politics, stroke intersectionality, you know, commonly called cultural Marxism, really seems to lack that. It seems to see activism as an end in itself, where with next to no concern as to consequences of the activism. Does it actually have the end result of emancipating people or not? Wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, sure. First of all, yeah, the McIntyre point, I think you must have got it out of Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, because Russell makes that point in his history there. He matches elements of Christian eschatology against Marxist eschatology. And yeah, so the resemblance is mapped out there as well. Yeah, on the endpoint thing, I think you're entirely correct, because, and it's related to the point I mentioned there, that for Marx, what's crucial is that capitalism has simplified the form of conflict in society. And so if you can get rid of that last single form of conflict, then you've got rid of the source of conflict. The capitalists are an ever diminishing minority. The proletariat, you know, in effect, almost everybody, and they do basically everything. And so knocking the head off the society just leaves everybody on equal terms as producers and consumers of equal status, and there's nowhere else to go. The failure of that, of course, was that the party turned out to be well able to form itself into a new oppressor class, and famously described in the book The New Class by Milovan Djilas from the former Yugoslavia. But in the case of the cultural Marxists, so-called, not only is there no obvious endpoint, it almost seems as if there cannot be one, because their sense of history seems to be that you know, history has been a nightmare from which we're just starting to wake up, and new forms of oppression have been discovered in the recent, in our lifetimes, basically, and so there's absolutely no reason for thinking there won't be numerous additional forms of oppression to add on. I haven't even mentioned them all. There's, you know, disability as another form of oppression. Fatness, that's right. And since you raised this unfortunate topic, we could also, you know, social, well, beauty, of course, you know, beauty and ugliness. And this just seems to be endless, that one can multiply endlessly. And the very idea of intersectionality seems to have come about with the thought that, you know, that, yeah, oppressions really are multiple, and they crisscross in all kinds of, you know, horrible and ugly ways. And so we just seem sort of trapped in a horrible web. In that way, you know, it looks like a little bit like the more nightmarish moments in Foucault, where we're just sort of trapped in a web of power and there's no way out of it. So, yeah, I think that's entirely right, that the whole mindset of our cancel culture, etc., is that people are terrible, society is terrible, we're just sort of dimly escaping from it, just dimly seeing ways out of it, and yet there are more and more forms of oppression yet to be discovered. And so it's basically, you know, it's a fundamentally depressing and disabling point of view in that regard.
But they never seem terribly interested in actual remedies for problems. For example, the situation of Aboriginal people in Australia is parlous. Many of them anyway, particularly those in remote communities. But they insist on, for example, romanticising traditional culture, assuming that it's free of flaws. But yet, you know, there's a lot of evidence, and you know, people like Jacinta Price and actually Marcia Langton had talked about this, that there are elements in that traditional culture which are terribly oppressive, especially towards women. But that can't be touched because it contravenes the ideology. And likewise, Black Lives Matter in America, the pattern of activism there, you know, there was that terrible crime involving George Floyd, which nobody has defended to my knowledge from Trump onwards. But the activism that flowed from that just seemed to be utterly destructive. And there's clear evidence now that it's led to the disempowerment or intimidation of the cops has led to, you know, a huge surge in homicide rates in major metropolitan centres. And this exactly the same phenomenon occurred back in 2015 after the Ferguson incident. But they never address that. They never say, well, is what we're doing actually making life better for the people in whose interests we claim to act? They just simply don't. And, you know, as I said, the old comms, they had an idea of a classless society where there'd be public ownership, production for use and not for profit. You know, it was a sort of a vision that
so the activism,
identifying with, and I did for a brief period when I was young, but I just could never buy this stuff. I don't think I would have even then.
Yeah, I think you see now that, protest and activism is taken to be sort of its own goal, so to speak. It's not because it doesn't, there's very little in the way of program and organisation and so on that comes out of it. That's right. There's certainly the difference with the old communists that, they had programs and they worked out strategies and, aimed to take things over. Well, nowadays the Russians and the Chinese haven't forgotten this and doing their best to do a bit more of it. But you do think that a lot of, say, climate activism and so on and anti-racist activism is just its own justification. It shows that you're not part of systemic racism, I think. I was very struck by a picture of a scene from Portland where, Donald Trump has sent in the federal, whatever the particular force that was, federal police or something. There was a little demonstration on the side of a road there that I saw a picture of with people holding up placards saying anti-racism zone. It wasn't, it just seemed to be an ordinary suburban street, so the assumption has to be that that your peaceful suburban streets are racism zones, and you exempt yourself from this by setting up an anti-racism zone which separates you from it. But it does nothing to end the alleged racism zone, the quiet suburban street in which you grew up. Part of the problem, of course, is the very idea of systemic racism, again, is just a trap from which there seems no escaping. I think a lot of people who use the term probably only mean, racism is really bad in this country, and so they call it systemic. But the idea, surely, is that that the society embeds a system, a racist system, and so mum and dad quietly going about their daily lives embedded in this system and therefore implicated in it and therefore racist, etc. So it's just a nightmare from which you can't escape, actually.
Yeah, and I'd contend that the form of anti-racism we're seeing at the moment is in fact racist in multiple respects. To take the example of Aboriginal communities, particularly those in remote areas, those who say we must preserve traditional culture at all costs, basically end up implying that children in Aboriginal communities should have a lower standard of protection against violence and predation than children in non-Aboriginal communities. And indeed, we see precisely that, conditions being perpetuated without too much protest that would not be tolerated for non-Aboriginal children. So that's one respect. Another respect is that by saying that everybody has to somehow put themselves into some racial, multiple other identities pigeonhole, and that in effect determines what they can say and what they can think. Ayanna Presley, who's one of the squad of AOC's followers in the
right, yeah,
expressed it very succinctly. She said, you know, we don't want black faces that aren't black voices. We don't want brown faces that don't speak as brown voices. In other words, you're expected to stick to a script. The only people who are exempted from that are the dreaded white people. You know, if you're a white person, you don't have to speak as a white person. Well, in some sense, you do. You have to.
Well, you can't help it, I think, is perhaps the point. Yeah.
That's how you.
Yeah, and so anyone who's a black face and not speaking as a black voice is therefore, you know, some kind of Uncle Tom or something. They've been tricked into speaking with a white voice, etc. Yeah. The very idea of whiteness is itself a curious one because, well, dare I say, I'm not even sure if you're antique enough for this, Peter, but I'm certainly pleased to say I'm not. That when Arthur Caldwell brought out his first batch of migrants, they were all from the Baltic, and he paraded them in front of the cameras so that the locals could see that that these migrants were white. Okay. Well, obviously he didn't bring out the Greeks and Italians. Okay, and you sort of think about what attitudes in this country were to Greeks and Italians back in the 50s. They were not classed as white. All right, white meant the Anglos and the sort of tinted peoples of the Mediterranean were the other ones. So they weren't white, but now they've become white because they're not black in any sense, and they're not Chinese. So now they're sort of they've become white. So they've been, so to speak, whitewashed. And in fact, I thought about this in advance, since I've actually got a little passage here from a book by an American philosopher, Justin Smith, talking about these issues. He says that recent history shows that ethnic groups can easily be shifted from one racial category to another. But it would be absurd to suppose that a change in racial designation ever results from a closer inspection of the physical features of members of these groups. Instead, plainly, to call someone white is not to give a bare report of the perception of a white-coloured entity, but rather to offer a sort of colour-coded value judgment. So I think that's on the money. And he goes on to say, race, it seems, is in the end really just an evaluative notion masquerading as a natural kind. I think that's on the money, that who gets counted as white is, so to speak, who's fully accepted into society, and who gets counted not as white is not. One can sort of think here that very obviously Aborigines in this country are not classed as white. Now, the Chinese, by and large, you know, typically described as yellow, but they're not classed as outside, so to speak, you know, normal society, or however one would put it. And so they're pretty close to being honorary whites, and maybe even Indians, subcontinentals, you know, might even get close, despite the fact that many of them are darker than Aborigines and so on. So so whiteness is a kind of social value category as much as it's as anything else. In fact, when I look at you in the picture here, I can see that you're white, and no doubt you're whiter than me. You know, when I was growing up, people always thought I was a wog, and Greek specifically, and so you know, less visible now since the hair has changed colour radically. But yeah, what counts as whiteness and what doesn't, what is as much as anything a marker of a sort of full membership.
It's even weirder than that. One of the founding figures in the so-called whiteness studies, this branch of, which is a branch of critical race studies, a guy called Noel Ignatieff, his seminal work was about the Irish immigrants into the United States into the 19th century, and he contended that they weren't actually white.
No, from this Smith point of view, they're not white. No, that's right, because they're on the bottom of the pile.
Even though they're as white as anybody.
Well, even whiter, if anything.
So they sort of say whiteness is not to do with phenotype, you know, sort of external visual features. They say that on the one hand, but if you actually have white skin, that somehow in itself confers privilege. You know, in other words, they affirm the phenotypical criterion on the one hand, and then say they're not. Oh, really, it's not about that. But the odder thing still, exemplified by the case of Elizabeth Warren. In fact, the biologist, zoologist Richard Dawkins was the first to bring this up. You know, that the current ideology is that your racial identity is determined not by what on balance you are, but if you have the slightest trace of, say, Aboriginality, or in the case of Elizabeth Warren, who claimed and managed to be treated seriously for a period as being Native American on the basis of some minute genetic inheritance.
A fragment.
And this is so we've sort of moved from Martin Luther King, judged not by the colour of your skin but the content of your character. Now we're now judged by the minutiae of your DNA. There used to be it's sort of an interesting obverse of the old racist one drop rule. You know, that in the
yes, it's
you were black.
It's the reverse of that. Yeah,
the touch of the tar brush, all that sort of stuff.
Touch of the tar brush. That's right.
And theory of hypo descent is the more elevated pseudo-scholastic version, scholarly version of it.
Yeah, on this, you know, I mean, I was always struck by what I thought to be a kind of principle hiding away in Hegelian philosophy. The idea that cultural attitudes shift through contradictions and so on. It's very interesting to think about the ways in which values are shaped in societies. I always thought about this with respect to that famous saying that history teaches us that people learn nothing from history, because I think that's wrong. I think what they learn is one big thing, and the one big thing they learn was the important lesson from the previous cataclysmic event. So, you know, racism became a huge issue after the Second World War, initially because of Nazism, and then sort of, in a way, gaining momentum from resistance to racism there, the decolonisation and so on. So nowadays, to call someone a racist is about as bad as you can call someone. You know, despite the best efforts of the feminists, people are going to be far more upset at being called a racist than being called a misogynist. All right, I think that might be one that they might want to tough out. All right, well, maybe not, but you see what I mean. That the power of that charge of being called racist outstrips everything else. And why is that so? It certainly wasn't always so. I think it's the trauma of the Second World War in particular, and kept alive certainly in the States through the trauma of slavery and the long period of Jim Crow and so on after that. So it's a certain kind of idea which gets a grip, and whereas in previous times different sorts of ideas were dominant. You know, I think one of the things which really shows up, I think, when you examine 19th century sort of social Darwinism and things of that kind, is it's striking how much the really crucial distinction is between being civilized or savage. The right of the civilized nations to dominate and control the savage nations is treated almost as a matter of course. Darwinism helped to make this sort of scientifically respectable and even more dangerous, because it implied that the civilized were more evolved than the savage and so on. So there's that huge contrast there. There's hostility to slavery in the 19th century, but there's certainly no hostility to race, where race is marked by savagery rather than civilization in those terms. You know, so the different categories that have power at different times, I think, often are shaped by sort of social and cultural trauma, and then determine the weight of various kinds of insults or criticisms or the like. So and as a result, then the charge of racism can't be handled sensibly. So we see in the case of Kuhn Cheese, a good example here. I presume that guy's name is probably Cohen. Kuhn is probably.
No, it's actually Kuhn.
Well, I know it's Kuhn, but where did that come from? It's either he arrived in Ellis Island. It was probably Kuhn, and they just spelt it in the Ellis Island way, or it could have been a version of Cohen. So the H in Cohen, Cohen normally, sometimes Cohon, and with the Cohen brothers, Coen. All right, the H has disappeared there. Well, if the H disappeared from Cohon, then you've got Coon, and not impossible that could end up being Kuhn, because otherwise it's a mysterious name. Where could that have come from? Anyway, my point about it is that, look, it's insofar as Kuhn is still a so to speak, an active term of insult to Aborigines. So I would have thought it sort of had its day. I didn't think it's the sort of thing people would say very much anyway. But insofar as that's an active term, then yes, that's a very unfortunate name for that cheese, and maybe it's a good reason for changing the name. But one thing that's not true is that the name is racist. All right, and so a more sort of nuanced handling of the issue is impossible, or seems to be impossible, just because the charge of racism is made. Racism is the worst thing we can do, and so all we can do is flee from it and apologise for it, and so on.
Yeah, quite right. We'll get onto the chat inputs in a second, but just one final point. I wonder if you could talk a bit about particularly, I guess, Foucault and his notions about the relationship between knowledge and power. He seems to infer a kind of a two-way relationship between the two, where possession of knowledge is a means of acquiring power, but not once you have power you can determine knowledge. I can see it. I think of a trivial sense in which the latter is true. Like the Chinese Communist Party, you can write your own version of Chinese history and make sure that that's treated as knowledge, but it's you can determine knowledge claims but not actual knowledge. But is there any more sense to Foucault's theory about that than what I just said?
I don't really think so. I think that Foucault's view is essentially the sort of oppression model with difference combined, that so that power is curiously defined not as something neutral but as something oppressive, and it sort of fragments into all kinds of tiny micro powers and so on, and it's everywhere, permeates everything. So we're trapped in a web of power. Foucault's claim then that that what we call knowledge is part of that web, so his term power knowledge is meant to capture that, as I understand it. I'm not a Foucault scholar, but as far as I can see, this is not. This is really about knowledge claims rather than knowledge. What we take to be knowledge, and it has what we take to be knowledge has a social effect. That's true, but in talking about this idea of power knowledge in this way, I think Foucault effectively reduces knowledge to just another form of power, and so there's a kind of well, I think again there's a kind of irrationalism built into it. The idea that you can see the postmodern element, because in the sense that it's produced all that talk about knowledges, different knowledges.
Sydney University's embraced them.
Sydney University, what, sorry?
Sydney University has embraced, in their cultural competency syllabus, which needs to be integrated into their entire programs.
Sydney University also it also embraced unlearning.
All equally valid.
So maybe you're not allowed to unlearn your cultural competencies or something, are you? Because you remember when they had that program about, we're so great because you can unlearn everything.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you do wonder who's running their PR campaigns. But the cultural competencies sort of stuff is partly the result of the takeover of universities by human resources departments, and sad. Well, I don't think there's anything good to be said about the tendencies of human resources departments to turn into sort of authoritarian entities that that do their best to ruin academic lives. Because here I speak from experience. I fled the Australian Catholic University after HR, fixed its beady eye on me, and I knew that I was either going to have several years of misery or I could just get out. So I just left. Nothing worse than actually challenging these jargon-infested mediocrities with any kind of assertion of independence. It enrages them, and you're going to lose. So I just cut my losses and left. So I'm familiar with that myself from first-hand experience.
But the most sinister aspect of this way of looking at knowledge is that it sort of destroys the rationale for rational argumentation.
Everything.
Knowledge is just determined by power. You, in order to determine knowledge, you gain power and exercise it rather than engage with people with different views.
Yeah, so there's a sensible half-truth hiding in there, it seems, but it's exaggeration has turned it into a kind of irrationalist thesis. Yeah, you can't argue for any kind of view and it being treated on its merits anymore, because it's just part of a system of power. So it's essentially a coercive act to argue for a point of view. And so, as I say, in my view, this idea of power knowledge really just reduces to the idea of power. That's what's going on. Because after all, the more familiar idea that knowledge is power because it enables you to do things and get things done and so on. That's as old as Francis Bacon. He said that back in the 16th century. So
probably went back to the cavemen, I would have thought.
Well, quite possibly so. But
anyway, on to questions. Now, this seems to be the first one from Enrico Brick. Isn't humiliate also likely to be captured as a harm under a well-argued liberal system, as argued by Joel Feinberg in Harm to Others?
Yes, I think that's a fair enough point. I thought that in the 18C, you get a gradation from offend, insult, humiliate, intimidate. And certainly at the intimidate end, I think, the harms are really in play there. At the offend end, it's not so. And there's a kind of gradation going on there, I think. But again, the point should be, the focus should be on harm. And so yes, humiliation will count when it's harmful. A casual humiliation of someone, a put down or something of that kind. Well, you don't want that to be, a legal matter. Where there's a kind of, sort of systematic attempt at humiliation, then that's a different story, and the harms can very easily, typically will be part of that. I mean, one of the things I had wanted to say is when it's a problem for liberalism that, it's an idea that develops where there's no assumption about particularly vulnerable minorities. With high-minded chaps like John Stuart Mill, for example, he's cheerfully of the thought that there's the working class down there, but he's going to look after them because he at least is rational and he'll defend their interests as well. But, the problem with societies with significant vulnerable minorities is that they are far more readily harmed as groups than sort of average typical individuals are. So, consistent insult and humiliation of, minority ethnic group or Muslims or something of this kind has more quickly generates harmful effects than is the case with, sort of random individuals who belong to the typical ethnic and cultural character of the nation. So yes, I'm answer to Enrico there is I'm not against that point at all. I think just that the emphasis should be on harm, and to say that sometimes the harms could be, forms of systematic humiliation or the like.
Okay, next point. Anthony Carr, does economic success or failure determine culture, or it is the other way around? Are you not a Marxist?
Well, I think the power, the cultural power of the economically powerful is certainly a huge force, and one would be foolish to underrate it. It's as we know, people are endlessly going to complain about, the main media companies and so on, and their capacity to control things. Some forms of economic power are not cultural power. Mining comes to mind, perhaps because it happens away from population centres and so on. That economic power is exercised. It exercises cultural power in the sense that the government will make rules that facilitate their activity and so on, but it doesn't impact on or has very little impact on the sort of general cultural values of the society. In contrast to, say, the media companies and so on, where the cultural impact is huge. But I think that what I'm against is a sort of any kind of one-way determinism to say that that economic power just dictates cultural content, so on. I'm in favour of the idea that cultural forces exert independent power. They perhaps do so less consistently than do those kinds of cultural forces driven by economic capacity, like, for example, the media industry and so on. But I think a lot. Well, this will give me a chance to say something about feminism, make myself really unpopular. I think that the advent of modern feminism is far better explained by keeping in mind a few Marxist dicta than by applying the oppression model. I've often said this before, when the feminists took over the wrong bit of Marxism. If they'd instead focused on what sorts of changes in the sort of factors of production, or is it relations of production? Can't remember which is which. If one, put it this way, if one focuses on economic change and technological change that has happened since 1945, you see that modern feminism is inevitable. Two major things happened. There was effective control of contraception and indeed of sexual disease transmission. That contraception will do here. It gave women the capacity to govern, to control their fertility when it was going to have, when it would produce children and when it wouldn't. The second thing was the development of the information economy after 1945, which led to the creation of huge numbers of jobs that were clean and safe, well paid, required education rather than brawn, and so on, and for which women were well suited, and for which there was no reason why they wouldn't want to have them. So those two things in place, you see that the old accommodation, if you like, between men and women just had to go. That it was no longer in women's interests to stay home and mind the babies. They could determine when the babies would happen, and they could get jobs which gave them real improvements in their standard of living. And so it was absurd to think that they wouldn't want them. They had to push to get them, but the justice of their cause again was something that ultimately the so-called oppressive patriarchy was unable to resist. It helped to show the falsity of the assumption that women could be thought of as something like slaves, that no slave revolt was ever so successful and so bloodless. So, so focusing on the economic changes and technological changes following on from them that happened since the Second World War showed why transformation of the role of women and therefore of female values was, and therefore also as a result of male values, was, I think, something that was, inevitable, going to happen. As I say, the feminists don't like me saying this because it undermines their sense of heroic opposition to fierce male forces, etc. I think, the men turned out to be paper tigers. But why was that? Well, because eventually they could see the women had a case. And in some ways it served their own interests as well. Why not have a wife who makes scads of money as well? You're going to live a lot better yourself. Anyway.
You heard of the James Damore case at Google?
No. Oh, the guy who got kicked out of Google for
he was
maybe men and women had different interests. Yeah.
He's a software engineer who they were invited to, at one of the company's internal meetings to submit their views about gender equity, etc. And he submitted his view, which was that the relatively low representation of women in STEM, for computer software architecture and programming and so on, was not because they were less good at it on average, but that they had different career preferences. That in particular they were, the claim he made was, citing some evidence, was that women tend to have a greater preference for working with people, as to, whereas men, or the archetypal computer nerd, is more interested in abstractions and objects and things. And that primarily so that to imagine you're going to get, by aggressively pursuing something close to 50-50, you would actually get there with such a priority was misplaced. It was an interesting point, but in
I think you can. Well, basically I agree with that. I think that women, we sort of think about. When I tend to think of. If you sort of try to date when modern feminism, by this I'm leaving 19th century feminism out of it because I think that had different causes. When is it? So early 60s or something when Betty Friedan writes her book and so on. I remember when I arrived at university in 1970, that was the year in which Kate Millett's Sexual Politics appeared and Germaine Greer's Female Eunuch, I think, was that same year or the year after. So if you sort of take those things dating, once the sort of contemporary feminist movement got going, there's been 50 years of it, for goodness sake. Young women at university now are the granddaughters of those women. So there's been a long established culture now of feminism, and certain aspects of feminism have been enthusiastically embraced, and other aspects have simply failed to eventuate. And this is one that that lots and lots of effort is put into getting women into STEM courses and so on, and that effort still continues to give pretty low-level results. It's interesting that I think you can see it in a range of disciplines that of that kind. Philosophy fits in this picture as well. Anything where sort of abstraction is the game, the women tend to be there in lesser numbers. The striking thing is that the few women who are there are nearly always extremely good, and it's sort of, that might be an explanatory thing there. It's not because it doesn't prove that women are better at it than men. But the women who are in there are, on average, better than the men. And I think it shows that the natural thought there is that the women who are attracted to go on in, say, STEM or philosophy or whatever, are those who are really good at it. and so they keep going. Others for whom it's harder work, they decide to do something else. One other thing that's, I was just going to say, you look at some of the rhetoric that goes around careers and so on now, which were, certainly never heard of them, 50 years ago, and that is, work-life balance, for example. Who pushes that? I mean, essentially, that's the women pushing that. They're the ones who want the work-life balance. The blokes might, they wouldn't mind a bit of it, but by and large, they want to, rise up the top in their career, etc. There's much more, sometimes the men get trapped and want to get out of it. It's true, but the drive to succeed in the career just seems to be, a much stronger force in men than in women, and the women look for, what for them is a satisfying mix of interests and activities.
All right, well, moving on. This is a really key question, this one. Steve, is that a model Trabant on your bookshelf?
Enrico, it is. Oh.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, that's great.
Oh, what's mine? This fabulous thing comes from a sort of sheltered workshop, I think it is, in Germany. It's called Werkhaus, Werkhaus. You can, it's a desk organizer. That's what it is. You see?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Good. Anyway, moving on.
Oh, just a minute. No, look, Enrico's got to see the importance of this, because you can get a combi. And amongst other things, you can get the Desheveur. Oh.
All right. Well, you can get them on. Are they available on eBay or wherever?
I'm sure you can order them over on the web. Werkhaus, Werkhaus.
Right.
It's a
anyway. Look, we better
German sort of sheltered workshop thing.
Very important.
They're fabulous.
Question. As an emergent property, culture is never causal. True or false?
Oh, I'd say that's false. I think culture sometimes is causal. I don't see why it's an emergent property.
I would have thought if it said if culture is an epiphenomenon, it would never be causal. In other words, something.
Interesting to think about Darwinism here in this light, because there's certainly strong tendency amongst perhaps maybe a minority of Darwinians, but there's a strong tendency amongst quite a number of Darwinians to argue that culture is a separate force in human history, in effect a separate evolutionary force. In fact, I can even say that it goes way back as far as Alfred Russel Wallace in particular, because he argued very directly that once human beings have worked out that that they can skin the bear and put on his clothes, so to speak, then there's no longer any naturally selective pressure towards getting a tougher hide or getting a hairier body or something. You don't need it, because your cultural innovation, killing the bear and putting on the pelt, means that your own physical body is no longer something subject to natural selection. Instead, your cultural achievements have changed the game, and that this applies all over the place. So it is interesting that Darwinians, who often thought of as people who all about biology rather than culture, I mean, it's quite a pronounced minority view amongst Darwinians that culture is an independent force.
Christopher Carr makes an assertion: cancel culture is a new variant of authoritarianism. We'll probably tick that.
Yes, I think it's sort of wannabe authoritarianism. I think that's how I think of it. John Stuart Mill made a rather depressing observation at one point in his autobiography, where he said, maybe liberalism is the kind of thing that flourishes only sort of in between, you know, as one cultural force is weakening and a new one hasn't quite grown up to replace it. He's sort of thinking of the decline of Christian values, liberalism growing up as a kind of, well, as the Marxists would say, a transitional phase, and the new replacement system will be illiberal by comparison. And so I think we see that cancel culture shows either the confidence or the ambition of those with, you know, different point of view, and that, so I do think of it as wannabe authoritarianism, and we have to hope, I think, that Mill is wrong, that liberalism can function as, and what I have in mind here in particular is, you know, the value of freedom of expression, that can continue to function because it's become so useful in complex modern societies, that we've generated a very complex society. We're very good at generating very complex messes as a result. And so we need all the intellectual resources we can muster often in order to deal with them. Sadly, too much public debate is just name calling, well, in effect, little more than name calling. But when you've got a complex society that has fine achievements and also unexpected disasters, then they can't be achieved just by sending the slaves out to, you know, build the next pyramid or whatever. You've got to, you need intellectually sophisticated solutions to the problems that you generate. And for that reason, I think liberalism, in the sense of protecting space for expression of different ideas, is pretty crucial for the successful continuation of our kind of society.
Okay, now.
Oh, Enrico again.
Oh yeah, this is a bit less to do with the Tribune. It's an assertion, which I think is probably right. Not all emergent property, he's responding to philosophies of science.
Yeah, yeah, he's criticising you, not me. There's some cultural.
He's not criticising me. I agree with that.
You said that culture was an epiphenomenon. I never said that.
That's what Marxism says. I didn't say I said.
Oh, well, Marxism says that. Yeah. Well, I think that's not true. So I'm.
Yeah. No. Well, we can agree. We can agree with that.
Yeah.
Moving on. Paul Retty. We all think that prejudice is bad. Is it possible for any human being to not be prejudiced at all?
Probably not. But you know, the question is, you know, prejudices aren't all equally bad. You know, a prejudice is often just an unexamined assumption, and when one is brought up short by having, you know, the untested character of your assumption pointed out, then there's no reason. Well, you know, then it's up to you to address it. So I don't think prejudices are unchangeable. They're not sort of, you know, carved in stone, so to speak. If for those people for whom they are carved in stone, these are people who are not particularly interested in the truth. Your prejudices can sometimes be a very comfortable home in which to live, and many people enjoy doing so. But I think that's the key thing. Yes. Not, in fact, we'll not even say, you know, that it has even been argued that that prejudices are necessary. I think that's the best light to put on someone who I'm not particularly well acquainted with, but the German phenomenologist, whose name escapes me, who, what is his name? Oh, anyway. Yeah, he argues that prejudice is necessary and good. Part of the point there is that if you think of prejudices as a bit like instincts or something like that, and you've got to have pre-rational ways of dealing with the world. Rationality is a slow process. I suppose you can think about it as a little bit like, you know, what's that sort of thinking 1 and 2 in whatever that book's called. I'm having a mental blank now. You know what I mean?
Sorry.
who's the author of that book about thinking fast and slow? That.
Oh,
that
right.
So prejudice is a little bit like thinking fast, or perhaps verging on instinct, and the rationality is thinking slow. It's where you sort of go over it and test it and revise it and so on. To some extent, having a set of more or less instinctive responses to the world is necessary for action. So if one called those prejudices, then not all prejudices would be bad. But the important thing is that what preconceptions that you have that where they run up against reality or criticism or whatever, that you make the effort to address them. Because I don't think in that sense prejudices are, as I say, set in stone.
Well, look, the next 6 chats are a very erudite exchange between Enrico and Philosophy for Science and Tony Zara and Newman about whether emergent properties are necessarily epiphenomenal. So probably should move on to another.
Why don't I leave them to it? Yeah.
Leave them to slug it out in the chat.
Yeah.
Anthony K, are the types of people who in the past were attracted to Marxism similar to the types of people today who are attracted to identity politics? That's an interesting question.
I'd say yes and no. Those who are similar would be, sort of disaffected youth looking for something to, for whom the ideology serves as a way of expressing their anxieties about society or their dissatisfactions with it. So in that sense, there's, back in my day, when universities were full of Maoists, for example, Julie Bishop didn't notice that they went away. So it's even the particular kind of Marxism varied at times. So yeah, social radicalism, left-wing radicalism, I think one common, it appeals to, a certain group of individuals no matter what, particularly when young and when it can be a bit of a shock to discover that the world is nastier than you might have expected. And radical politics is one route to go down. But another way in which Marxists in the past were very different from contemporary people were, working men's associations were, well, they wouldn't all have been Marxist, but Marxism was sort of, one way of making sense of proletarian life. And so in that sense, those people, so not young university students or the like, but the sort of industrial working class, for them, although they weren't all Marxists, for them, for those who were, Marxism was that explanatory system that made sense of why their world was the way it was, and it held out hope for change. And so again, had scope for sort of serious and orderly, not necessarily orderly, serious ongoing involvement with a program for the future and so on. So I think in that respect, old Marxists wouldn't entirely fit the modern social radical.
Okay, there was a comment denouncing Le Corbusier and his fascistic buildings. A bit of positive affirmation. Brilliant analysis. Thanks, Steve. Tony.
Oh, thanks, Philosopher of Science.
Your talk helped me gain new glimpses into these topics. So it's
thank you, Tony.
Well. This is a 2-part one from Barking Madeline. Imagine transmetalism. When lead wants to self-identify as gold and gets offended if it's not addressed as gold, thinking on the periodic table, some gas wants to trans by dropping an electron. Part 2 means that how stupid the whole thing has become. There you go.
Well, look, I will say one thing for trans periodic tables. In my original version of this, I did point out that the periodic table is in fact something of an idealization of what exists, because it ignores ions and isotopes. So, not every oxygen atom has got 16 electrons. I think it's 16, isn't it? Or is it 8? Can't remember. Anyway, whatever it is, it could have extra neutrons or more or less electrons, and so in that sense it could be trans, not cis. But there you go. Otherwise, yes, a lot of, well, I think there's a certain amount of room for thinking that the sheer popularity of trans identities and so on is again an indication of of a couple of things, of how relentless images of beauty are for women, for young women who announce themselves to be trans, who sort of feel that some of this is an escape from the pressures to be look like a supermodel, for some of older men, I do wonder, a friend of mine calls this male menopause, and one does wonder whether, just as some adolescent males hit puberty more or less overnight, and they're just a different creature the day after, I do wonder, I must admit, whether with adult males in their 50s or 60s or whatever, sometimes their testosterone levels just disappear through the floor, and they then feel like a different person, and that trans identities for those characters, become a way of expressing or capturing this sense of transformation in the personality. For others, it's a different story. Of course, they've always, that the idea that someone has always felt that they were in the wrong body. One can be critical of whether this is muddled thinking or not. Nonetheless, it's a genuine phenomenon, and it, in these cases, often drives not merely transgender, but actually sex change, where people have the fateful operation and have their bits rearranged, and that whole experience can be quite an extraordinary one, of course, and that for those people, they're not doing that lightly, although it doesn't always follow that they're doing it for the best of reasons or the clearest of reasons. But anyone interested in that, I just recommend that they would read Jan Morris's book called Conundrum. She started off as a male, decided very early on that she was in the wrong body, but became a mountaineer for a while, or at least was part of an Everest expedition, but eventually decided, after being married with a couple of children, to have a sex change. And that book describes very clearly and vividly just what that was like, and what the consequences felt like as well, and so on. So, I think there's a lot of muddle in the trans world, and it's dressed up with a lot of aggression. Aggression is often an indication of confusion and muddle. So I think, there is a lot of that around, but there are also some extraordinary cases where people do feel they're in the wrong body. And all one has to do is look at a little bit of embryology, embryological development, and you can see how this kind of thing isn't crazy. That is, body plans, male or female, are formed early in embryological development, whereas brain development happens quite a bit later. And so the idea that there can be a mismatch between bodily shape and mental character is not at all crazy. I think, as I say, I think the science of embryo development shows that this is a perfectly reasonable outcome. And so for people who feel that that they're just not quite right, they're not quite in the body that they think they ought to be, is not a crazy thought, which is not to say that they're always right when they say it, but a lot of trans ideology is hostile to the thought that there might be biological explanations. Again, gender fluidity, etc., which tries to make everything a choice.
Right.
Right.
Ron Sinclair. Hello, Ron. Cancel culture warriors are totalitarians. You either agree with them or else you need re-educating, even punished in one form or another. They represent the antithesis of reason. We can agree with it.
Not much room to, I don't feel overly inclined to argue with that. Want to be totalitarians. Often they're people who just do not understand how anyone could think differently. Sometimes they're just dumb, or sometimes they've been brought up on a sort of on a one-dimensional diet of ideas, and to counter a new one can be such a shock that their natural reaction is to reject. There is a famous old line about truth. That some new theory, some new true idea is at first it's rejected, then it's argued with fiercely, and then finally it's accepted as if it were obvious. So at first it's evil, then it's wrong, but and can be proven wrong, and thirdly, well, it's obviously right. So what was the issue there about? And there is certainly something to be said about that.
Now, we've been going an hour and a half, and I imagine you're getting a bit tired. Do you want to wind up, or do you want to do 3 more?
Yeah, unless there's any really different question or something, then yeah, I'd probably.
Well, there'll no doubt be a lot because we've gotten about halfway through them. Less than
right.
But we always have this problem. We always run out of time. So apologies to all those who posted in the chat that we didn't get to. We never do. So at that point, I think we'll wind up, and I'd like to thank everybody who contributed, all our audience, and all those who contributed into the chat window. And in particular, I'd like to thank our speaker today, Steve Buckle, who delivered a real tour de force, I think. Well done, Steve.
Oh,
great.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. Yeah.
So at that point, I'll thank everyone and end the broadcast.